In this video, we're talking about the opposite of a number and negative numbers. And when we say the opposite of a number, all we mean is the number we start with multiplied by -1. So in other words, the opposite of 1 is -1. The opposite of 2 is -2. And the reason is because if we take 2 and we multiply 2 by -1, we get -1 times 2 is a -2. So the opposite of 2 is -2. In the same way, if we start with a negative number like -10, the opposite of -10 will be 10 because we took -10, we multiplied it by -1, and when we multiply these two negative numbers together, they cancel with one another and we get a +10. So the opposite of -10 is +10. Now we can use number lines to better see why this is the case. So we're going to use number lines to simplify some of these expressions. First, we're starting with the values 3 and -3. So these are just two individual values, 3 and -3. So if we want to graph or plot 3 on a number line, the fact that this is +3 tells us that we start at the origin here, 0, and we move to the right in the positive direction 3 units. So 1, 2, 3, and we get to this point here, 3. Because remember, when we have a number line, everything this way is positive, and everything this way to the left is negative. So when we see +3, we move to the right in the positive direction 3 units, 1, 2, 3, and we get the point 3. Now we know that the opposite of 3 is -3, and that makes sense to us because it's on the opposite side of the origin when we're looking at the number line. And if we want to take the opposite of 3, we just go to the other side of the origin, the same distance, and we get to this point here, -3. So 3 is the opposite of -3, and negative is the opposite of +3. We can also see that because if we break this -3 down into smaller pieces, we're starting with just 3, right? Ignore the negative sign for a second. We're starting with 3. If we graph 3 on our number line, we start at 0 and we move to the right 3 units. 1, 2, 3, and we get to this point here, 3. Then if we go and apply this negative sign, it tells us take the opposite of 3. So we start at this point 3 where we were before, and we jump to the left-hand side to find the opposite, and we get the point -3, and so that's how we end up with this total value here of -3. Now, if we look at an expression where we have two values that are added together or subtracted from one another, here we have 1 plus a -2. So if we graph that along our number line, we start with +1, that means we start at the origin, and we move to the right in the positive direction 1 unit, and we get to this point here, +1. Now we want to add to that -2. We have 1 plus a -2. Well, this plus sign here basically tells us go in the direction indicated by the number that follows here. So this -2, the fact that this is a negative, tells us to move to the left. So this plus sign says, yes, move to the left. So -2, we're moving to the left from the point where we were. We go 1, 2 units to the left, and we get to this point here, which is -1. So what we know is that this is equal to -1, and that makes sense to us because we know that adding negative numbers is the same as subtracting, so this is really just 1 minus 2, which we know is equal to -1. On the other hand, if we say 1 minus a -2, this minus sign in the middle here tells us go in the opposite direction of what follows. So remember the plus sign said go in the direction of the number that follows. Since this is -2, it said yes, go to the left. Because we have a negative sign here and we have a negative number that follows, this -2 right here tells us move to the left. But the minus sign in the middle says go in the opposite direction. So instead of going to the left, we're going to go to the right. So what we're doing here is we start with 1. So that means we start at the origin, we move to the right 1 unit. So we go 1 unit and we end up here. Now, if we look at this -2, this -2 would tell us move to the left 2 units. But the negative sign in the middle, this negative sign in the middle says go in the opposite direction. So don't move to the left, move to the right. So if we start at this point where we were, and now we move to the right 2 units, we get 1, 2, and we end up at 3, so we can say this is equal to 3. And that should make sense to us because we know that 1 minus a -2, when we have an even number of negative signs, they cancel with one another to become a positive sign. So 2 negative signs become a positive sign, and this is the same as 1 plus 2, which is equal to positive 3, and that's why we end up here at positive 3. So looking at a little bit more of a complicated example, here we have 3 plus 2 plus negative 5 minus 3. So again, if we start at the origin, we always start at the origin here, and we move 3 units in the positive direction. So we go 1, 2, 3, and we end up here at positive 3, and we've taken care of this part. We have plus, that means go in the direction indicated by the 2 here, and this is a positive 2, so we continue, we move 2 units to the right, and we end up at this positive 5 value right here when we add the 2. So this plus sign says go in the direction indicated by the negative 5. Negative 5 tells us to go to the left, so from where we were here, we go to the left 5 units. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We end up back at the origin after we add a negative 5. And now we have minus 3. So the positive 3 here by itself tells us go to the right. But this negative sign here tells us go in the opposite direction of what's indicated. So instead of moving to the right, we move to the left 3 units and we say 1, 2, 3. And we get to this point here, which is negative 3. So we know that this whole value is equal to negative 3, and that makes sense because if we just do the arithmetic, we get 3 plus 2 is 5, plus a negative 5 gets us back to 0, minus 3 gets us to negative 3. Now essentially what we learned from doing this is what we talked about in the beginning, that 1 is the opposite of negative 1, that 2 is the opposite of negative 2, and that 10 is the opposite of negative 10. So we know about opposite numbers now, but we also know that an even number of negative signs is equal to a positive sign, that an odd number of negative signs is equal to a negative. So in other words, if we're trying to simplify these expressions here, we have a negative, negative, negative 2, or a negative, 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 negative 2, what we can do is plot this on a number line here. So if we take this first example and we say that this is 0, this is positive 2, and this is negative 2, if we just start with the 2 by itself here, then we know we're starting here at positive 2. When we add to that our first negative sign, we're going to take the opposite. So in other words, negative 2 means the opposite of positive 2. So we come over here to negative 2. When we add on another negative sign, we're taking the opposite of negative 2. So we come back this way, and we end up here again at positive 2. And then we take the opposite of negative, negative 2, or the opposite of negative 2. We come back this way, and we end up again at negative 2. So this is going to be equal to negative 2. On the other hand, if we look at this second example here, and we do the same thing, and we say 0, positive 2, negative 2. We start with just the 2, so we start with just the 2. That starts us at positive 2 in the positive direction. We put a negative on the front. We take the opposite. That gets us over here to negative 2. We put another negative on it. We take the opposite again. We go back in the other direction. Now we're over here at positive 2 again. We put another negative in front. That means take the opposite again, and you end up back over here at negative 2. And then we put another negative in front, and that means take the opposite again, and you end up back here at positive 2. So this is equal to positive 2. And what we can see then is that if we have an even number of negative signs, so in this case we have 4 negative signs, we want to cancel them in pairs. So 2 negative signs becomes a positive, 2 more negative signs becomes a positive, and we're just left with positive 2. An odd number of negative signs leaves you with a negative. So we cancel 2 negative signs, we're only left with the 1 negative sign, which can't cancel, so we're just left with negative 2.